Welcome to Confessions of a Parent Coach. I'm Coach, a mother of four, and potty talker, Ann Kaplan. This is the podcast where I confess something from my own parenting and coaching life, teach a lesson around it, and answer your questions. Even we parenting experts are far from perfect, and the real magic happens when we get down with all that imperfection. We get into the gritty side of parenting here, so earbud up and dive in.
Welcome into another episode of the podcast, everybody. I'm excited to be here with you listeners again to talk about back to school, but in a kind of a weird way because we're in the middle of the school year. But, for most of us, we are sort of just a few weeks back into the school year after our winter break and things like that. And I thought it would be worth kind of revisiting some of the things that we really need to be mindful of when it comes to supporting our kids in their schooling and education and stuff like that. I feel like as parents, especially if you're on social media or if you follow more than one parenting expert or whatever, we're sort of bombarded in August and September with back to school information. And that's really great. But, that sort of vigilance is important all year long. And for a lot of people, especially I know a lot of my clients, maybe the first semester didn't go amazing. And now we're trying to kind of have a quote unquote fresh start and like maybe hopefully have things go differently, this semester than they did last semester and everything. So I want to kind of talk about a couple of keys to success for school, sort of keys to a successful school year in general. And um my confession for this week is something that I've talked about before in my blog and in my emails, but I'm pretty sure I've never talked about it on the podcast before. This is a true story, and I know that my sister listens to this podcast, maybe not all the time, but um she is a big piece of this confession, and she can attest that I'm telling you a true story. So let's see. When my oldest kiddo was a freshman in high school, he was really not doing well in a million ways. And I'm sure you've heard me talking about that in different ways throughout the podcast and things like that, different things that he was struggling with, the treatment that he needed to have, et cetera, et cetera. But for today, I'm just going to talk about how he was doing in school, which is he wasn't. He was like failing all of his classes. He just really wasn't doing anything. Like if he was in the classroom, everything was fine, but anything he had to happen outside of the classroom, like his homework, studying, any projects that needed to happen, they just weren't happening. So he literally had done absolutely no schoolwork for that majority of the semester. And this was the fall semester. So we were getting close to like Thanksgiving time. And we had like meetings with his teachers to figure out like, okay, well, what can we do with this last like 3 weeks of school after Thanksgiving? And his teachers were like, well, he needs to get this stuff done over the break or whatever. And one of those things was a paper that he needed to write. And by that point, I had never, let me back up and say, like, I had never had a kid not doing at least acceptably in school. Like, I'd never had a child like on the brink of failing school or any of that stuff before. And so, I was just, it was all indicative of like some really messed up stuff that was going on with Elijah. And I was really, really focused on making sure that he didn't fail and, all of these things. And when I think about it now from, the perspective I have now, it's kind of silly how focused I was on this thing that was honestly not even the most important thing. But at the time it felt like it. And I think that's true for a lot of parents. It feels like really, really, really important, even though, you know, there's something way more important that's going on beneath the surface. And we forget the big picture of like, why do kids even go to school? And like, what is the point of all of this schooling at the end of the day and all that stuff? But I won't go down that rabbit hole quite yet. So we are celebrating Thanksgiving at my sister's house, and Elijah has this paper that he has to write. And he is kind of resisting doing the paper, or he'll say he wants to do the paper, but then he's just getting stuck and he's just not getting it. And I am so fixated on getting him across the finish line, to the point it all escalates to a moment when we are sitting at my sister's dining room table, and Elijah's got his computer and he's got, whatever, his notes or whatever. And I am literally sitting there with him like he's a first grader. Like, well, this is what the prompt says for the paper. And what do you want to say about that? And then he'll be like, well, I think I want to say this or that. And I'm like, okay, well, then just write that. And he's like, I just don't think that's the right, whatever. Eventually, like, even all of my hovercrafting prodding isn't even working. And so I wind up just taking the computer from Elijah and him saying, I basically am like, what do you want to say in your paper? And then I'm like taking dictation from him and typing it all out. And I'm doing all of this stuff. And even I'm saying, well, don't you think it'd be better if you said it this way or whatever? So I'm sort of like editing his paper for him while I'm typing his paper for him, and like holding this like boundary and container for him to like actually do the thing in the first place and all of this stuff. And my sister is just like staring at me slack jawed. I am like the older sister. I've had kids for longer than she has. Like, she often comes to me for like parenting suggestions and information and stuff like that. And, she is watching this person who up until now she's thought was a pretty decent parent just completely being a crazy person. And she actually starts kind of like laughing, and I it kind of like breaks the spell a little bit, and I look at her and I'm like, what's so funny? And she's like, you're literally doing his paper for him. And I was like, oh my God, you're right. I couldn't believe it. I had broken like every single parenting, you know, idiom that I have taught every single client I've ever had, including myself. Like, I have never parented this way. It was so messed up what I was doing. And I didn't even realize I was doing it until my sister pointed it out to me. So I will tell you that if you are falling into those patterns, if like you recognize yourself in this story, if you're so fixated on like, come on, we got to get this going, you need to get decent grades, you can't fail your classes, blah 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 blah. I really hope that this episode is this catalyst for you to take like a giant step backwards and recalibrate everything that you're doing. So let's dive into that. So, usually when I like to teach this stuff, I start with like a little bit of an anecdote, which I just gave you for me, but I'm also going to kind of give you an anecdote of an actual coaching conversation that I've had with a client before. So, you know, um, maybe you don't already know this, but I work with clients in lots of different ways. So I run a group program for moms, which you've probably heard me talk about before. And I work with parents individually. And I also work with parenting dyads, whether that's like two co-parents who are divorced or a couple that's still married or whatever. And this particular example came from a call with a couple where they wanted to talk about how to set their son up for success in middle school. And one of the examples that they used is about like his extracurriculars, and another one was about his homework. And they were kind of just like, we know our son, he's inevitably going to decide to like quit track, which is what he had signed up for. And he's inevitably going to forget to do his homework or whatever. And um this idea of like, how do I make it so that my kid won't do these things, or when he does do those things, he gets right back on track as fast as possible, which we all want. That, of course, it makes perfect sense that we want that. And as parents, of course, even when we're parent, even amazing perfect parenting involves helping our kids, be successful in whatever that means. But I think that sometimes we overcomplicate things because maybe the thing that we're looking at feels like a really big job, getting our kids across the finish line of an entire school year or an entire semester, that feels like huge and Herculean. But really, the formula for success no matter what situation we're in, whether it's like getting our kids to do the dishes or looking at an entire school semester. They really those kind of formulas never change. And you've heard me talk about authoritative parenting and all that stuff, and that's the gold standard in parenting, and that's true here too. But today I'm going to talk a little bit about like this kind of like three elements to this kind of successful school year formula. And those are creating the container, managing your mind, and being a resource. So I'm going to talk about each of those three things like individually. Create the container. You hear me talk about containers all the time, right? You create a container for your child by setting and enforcing boundaries. Those boundaries and your enforcement of those boundaries are kind of like the walls of the container, right? So when we have clear boundaries with our kids and we enforce them with clear, compassionate consequences, we now create a space inside of which our kids get to decide to do their homework. They decide to play sports. They decide to follow the school rules, or they don't decide to do that. They decide not to do those things. And then they get to experience the outcome of whatever they decided, right? So, in this example with this client, they decided to make a rule that screens and social time are available as long as there are no missing assignments at school. That's a great, very, very clear boundary with very, very clear ability to enforce that boundary. All we do is make sure that, screens are not happening until school assignments are taken care of. And that might mean taking our kid's phone. It might mean changing the Wi Fi password. It might mean hiding their remote, whatever it means, but it's doable. And it's doable with compassion. We can just say, babe, I'm happy to give you the remote as soon as you have no more missing assignments. Absolutely beautiful, love and logic, enforceable statement. And you can actually be super sympathetic if your kid's like, this sucks, it's not fair, all my friends are doing this or whatever. You can just say, yeah, I know it really does stink and I totally get it. It's a real bummer, and this is the rule, and that's it. Create the container. It might sound like I'm oversimplifying to say this, like, oh, so simple. Like, I'm not trying to oversimplify things, and obviously there are kids out there who have like nuances and everything, but that never, whatever nuance your child has, whatever, maybe they have a neurodivergence or something like that, it's irrelevant in terms of the necessity of the container. There might be something additional that's needed, but if you're not creating the container, that's where we need to start. So that's point number one. The second part I would say is managing your mind. What that means is as soon as we create this container, we start getting anxious about, well, but what if they still don't do their homework? But what if they still quit the track team, right? And in this case, that's exactly what happened. The dad, as soon as we decided, okay, this is what the rule's going to be, this is how we're going to enforce the rule, dad was like, I just don't really trust that this is going to work to keep him on track. And my response to him is like, oh, no, it definitely won't work. Like, that's not what the point of the container is. The container is not meant to make it so that your kid won't forget his homework or that your kid won't decide to quit the track team. The container we create never guarantees compliance, and that's not what they're supposed to do. Compliance is not a healthy part of parenting. It sounds gross because it is gross. Your container is not meant to be coercive. It's not meant to force compliance from your kid. Um, it's supposed to create a space for your child to mess up. So this kid is definitely going to skip his homework probably a few times, and he's probably going to try a bunch of other ways to test that container. And that's exactly what he's supposed to do. So what's really important is for us as parents to manage our mindset, to be calm and loving while our kids make those mistakes and just follow through with the consequence. But that only is possible when we are, making sure we're doing our own work to keep our heads on straight. And most parents skip this step. When I'm having conversations with clients about school, especially, it's like, tell me the exact, step by step, this, and this, so that my kid will do the thing that I want them to do. And that just isn't functional. It's not possible. There's nothing that will guarantee our kids to do what they need to do. The container allows our kids to learn lessons and then make their own decisions based on those lessons. And for us as adults, we might look at that kid and say, okay, well, you missed out on screen time. You didn't get to play video games. You didn't get to go to your friend's sleepover. The lesson is clear. Do your homework. But guess what? A different human being in that situation might take a different lesson from that situation, or they might need to experience things multiple times before they take that lesson. So we need to be able to stay calm and trust that our kids are learning, our kids are figuring this out. And all we need to do is hold that container and stay calm and present and loving. And this is the most important step of any parenting strategy. And it's the step that we skip the most because we're focused on what's outside of us. We're focused on our kids and what they're doing instead of focusing on our own work. If you don't do your own work, any single thing that you've ever heard from me on this podcast, or if you're working with me as a coach, or if you read my blog or any of that stuff, nothing that you learn from me will ever work if you're not doing your own personal work. And that is true for every single thing in life. I mean, to be honest. So let's talk about that third step. Be a resource. So, our kids aren't meant to just be stuck in a container and then we're totally hands off without any presence with them at all. But it's important for us to be a presence, a resource, a support to them, not a rescuer, a solver, a coercer, a manipulator, shamer, which is what we accidentally become. So when our kids realize they can't keep track of their assignments, and how are they going to realize that? Because they continue to lose screen time, because they continue not to be able to go to the sleepovers. And we, as a resource, could say, it seems like you're really struggling to keep track of your assignments. Would you like some help? Or, I'm happy to help you if you like, or let me know how I can support you. Any of those things would be amazing. And that's when we get to step in and be available and able to offer ideas like, well, what if you decide to use a planner, or how about a calendar app, or, even just writing down a to-do list can be really helpful. And even then, even when our kids come to us and say, well, how am I supposed to keep track of my assignments? We need to present all of that stuff just as a resource, as in, here's a buffet of options. What sounds good to you? Does any of this sound interesting to you? Like, some people use a planner. Some people just have a to-do list. Some people put a list on their phone. Some people put reminders on their phone. Like, how do any of those things work for you? You can choose which of those work, or you can choose not to do any of them. The container and the mindset we talk about previously is what sets you up to be able to be helpful and supportive in ways that actually help our kids grow and learn and change and do better. So think about how you're approaching the school year right now. Think about what this semester looks like in your mind. If you are like tied in knots and have a pit in your stomach about trying to get your kid across the finish line, stop everything. Do not pass go. We need a total reset, because you're not supposed to be getting your kid across the finish line. They're supposed to get themselves across the finish line. And if they're not doing it, that doesn't mean that now you do it. It means that we need to make it as possible as possible. That's the stupidest thing. I'm sorry I said that way. We need to make it as likely as possible, or as smooth as possible, or as available as possible for our children to get themselves across the finish line. But if they don't, if they're not, that never means that we then drag them across the finish line. That can't be the answer, because it doesn't work, and it's not even helping them. So remember that big picture I was talking about, like when I described this whole nonsense I was doing with Elijah. It seems laughable to me right now, because if you're able to look at, okay, the whole freaking point of school is that eventually my child is going to be able to go off into the world and land on their feet in whatever that looks like for them. And you dragging your kid across the finish line so they get a high school diploma, how is that helping your child do that? It might actually be better for you in some cases to, support your kid in dropping out of school and getting their GED and then going to a trade school or something like that, or not. I mean, there's so many different ways that landing on your feet looks. And if you're tuning to that idea of like, help this kid so that it's possible for him to land on his feet or for her to land on their feet, school becomes one possible way that that happens. And we become much clearer and able to assess the situation and realize, like, well, it doesn't seem like it's the way for this kid. And maybe that's not what I was picturing, but I'm open to it being different than what I thought. All of these things only become available to us when we are able to do that personal work, set the container, and let things, unfold the way that they will without micromanaging, all of those things. So, um, even if this does feel like oversimplifying, or even if there are other complicating factors in there, which I hear all the time, especially with neurodivergent kids, even if that's true, it still is also true that good parenting always comes down to these three things. But it can feel complicated in the moment, and we run around like headless chickens, helpless to get them back on track, focusing on the wrong thing, missing the forest for the trees. That's why I have a job. It's one of my biggest jobs in session with clients, is to look at the pandemonium that they present me with and make sense of it and help them make sense of it for themselves and boil it down to things and then say, okay, let's eat this elephant one bite at a time. It is possible to support our kids in getting to their, stable, successful adulthood if we are keeping our eyes on the right prize and doing our own work. So if you're ready to do that, if that feels resonant to you, if what I'm saying feels like right but hard and you want help doing it, this is why I am here. And I would love to meet with you and do one of those free consultations that you hear me talk about every week on the podcast. So click on the link and book it. What do you have to lose? An hour of your time where we get to chat and see if we're a good fit and get some new ideas and maybe some inspiration. And the biggest thing I want you to leave from your consultation with me with isn't having hired me necessarily, but it's hope. I want you to leave that session knowing that better is possible and with a few ideas of how to actually move toward that outcome. Have a great week, everybody. I can't wait to talk to you again. And take care, stay warm, do all of the things that you need to do to enjoy this January and the sort of lingering months of winter, which can be challenging, I know. Bye, everybody.
The episode is over, but there's more waiting for you. You can grab my free workbook, Getting Kids to Listen the First Time, that walks you through the fundamental principles I teach all of my clients and applies them to this very universal parenting challenge. So if you're sick of repeating yourself all day long or just want to learn more about my style, you'll definitely want to go to bit.ly/kidswholisten. And if you're ready to work with me, let's meet. Set up a free call at bit.ly/Kaplan call, and let's create an action plan that gets you exactly where you want to go. And of course, links to all this goodness are in the show notes. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you next time.